Hi, welcome everybody to this event today on securing the supply chain. Really glad that you've managed to join us. We will be recording the session for anyone that needs to drop out or anyone that missed it. It will be available later. We are accepting questions around 45 minutes in, so if you do have any questions for us, please feel free to pop them in the question box. I'm really excited to be joined by 4 colleagues today who I know have lots of thoughts and opinions about how we introduce third-party risk into our estates. I've got Emilian Chebuk, who is a cloud security consultant. We've also got Jordan LaRose, who's our incident response lead in North America. We've got Neil Rubert from our South African office, who has a passion for DevOps, and Thierry Decroix, who's our head of product security as well. So lots of different perspectives and backgrounds. And just to set the scene a little bit, I mean, you know, we're all familiar with supply chain attack or third-party attack. It's been in the news a lot lately. It's not necessarily something that's new. So these kind of attacks have been around for a while. And I wonder whether, in fact, the business of cyber attack is perhaps what's causing that leap, particularly when it comes to ransomware and thinking about that kind of one-to-many return on investment that you would get from this kind of attack. We're all familiar with ones that have been in the news recently, SolarWinds, Kaseya. To get us started, Thierry, I know that you actually had a personal experience, really, the impact of Kaseya. I wonder if you could start with sharing that story for us.
Yeah, I think indeed we've seen them in the news, or all of us have seen them in recent weeks. But to start off with a little story time, I live in quite a tiny town, 10,000 people in the middle of Sweden, surrounded by forests and lakes, pretty much, and more lakes and forests. And so when the Kaseya attack or supply chain attack happened, the first thing that I noticed was when I wanted to go and buy ice cream at the local co-op, and I couldn't. They didn't let us inside the shop because their point of sale system was no longer working, and which was kind of interesting to me. So I went to look back home, of course, at the news and what is happening, and that's when I first learned about the Kaseya attack. But what's really interesting is that here in Sweden, the co-op stores, which are about 800 of them across the country, most of them had to close between 2 and 5 days. While they rebuild their systems. But the interesting thing is that they are not clients of Kaseya at all. It's one of their suppliers, another company based in Norway that is a client of them and is using the remote access tool that Kaseya builds to administer servers and machines. So I thought that was a rather interesting real life experience, because most of the time we encounter these incidents as practitioners, as security consultants, both in trying to prevent these kind of attacks, but also in clearing up the aftermath and doing the investigations, as I'm sure Jordan can tell us about. But I thought, hey, let's start off with a little story on how my Saturday night ice cream outing went wrong.
Yeah, and I can certainly jump in and kind of give the other perspective. Unfortunately, I didn't get any ice cream either. But when I was, first called in to look at these Kaseya attacks, I was coming in as somebody who had already dealt with Revil in the past, had dealt with ransomware at scale. But when it comes to supply chain, it's a different beast, right? You don't necessarily have all of the tools that you would have in a normal incident response. The attacker is coming from a place that you don't have direct access to. They're coming from a sort of, I already know how I can exploit this environment because I know the software, I know Kaseya is here, and I know I can use it. So when we're looking at these incidents, it can be especially challenging to find an effective way to respond. So when I was first called in, the first Kaseya incident I looked at, the client honestly didn't even know if they were breached. They just said, we have Kaseya, we know that there's problems with it. Thanks to the news, can you guys come and take a look? So, we jumped in, dug into the environment, and yes, we did find that, Kaseya had been breached. We found that, Revil was in the network and were, attempting to spread out their influence and execute their attack. But, thankfully we we came in right at the right time, which doesn't always happen with incident response. But in this case, we did come in before the ransomware was actually deployed, and we were able to kind of, investigate this and try to stop them. But this was before really there were any IOCs or anything out there for Kaseya. So that's another thing that's really, it's a double-edged sword with these types of supply chain attacks. They're far-reaching. They hit many companies and people as a result. But it's also an opportunity for the community to come together and share threat intelligence, share defensive tactics, and basically come together to stop these attacks. Which when we're talking about isolated incidents, it's a much more everybody fend for themselves kind of scenario. So I'm interested to hear what my colleagues on the call have to say, regarding threat intelligence sharing and how we can sort of identify what the major risks are here with supply chain and maybe even prepare for those types of attacks or incidents.
Yeah, Jordan, definitely something that stood out for me was that just one thing that you said there is that you didn't really have an idea, or the people didn't really understand what was going on in their environments. And that's something that's very big, that plays a big part in the dev environment, because it's often an environment that's overlooked. You try to plan out as much as you can, but still, again, the developers try to add in ways and tools and libraries that just tries and make their life easier because of deadlines and whatnot that's placed on their heads. So that's what the open source community is for. It is to help people not necessarily have to solve the same problems over and over and again. But again, now this comes and bites everybody in the back, because it now puts this big target and big risk factor that's introduced into your company now. So I think that's a very big important part of the whole DevOps scene, is not necessarily trying to make it as fast as possible, but making sure that you keep track of what you're adding, making sure that you understand exactly what dependencies are part of each product that you put out, making sure that you know what's in there, what's in that space, so that you understand what your risk profile is. And if you can control it as much as possible. I think that's a very important part of ensuring that the entire DevOps space is secured in this as well. But yeah, I think the entire risk sharing, threat intel sharing, that's a very big part that I think we can draw like similarities from to the dev side as well. Making sure that you, like I said, document. And I think that's that's how the developers can play their part in that side. I think that's something from the DevOps side. Emilian, from your side, from the cloud side, what do you feel?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with what you said there, Neil. And I think from the cloud side, there's also another point to add upon yours. And that has to do with applications in general, right? You're not just talking about the development part of it, but in the broader cloud, any sort of services, applications, that you, because of your business purposes or any sort of activities that you need to do in your estate, you may need to take advantage of different applications. And so you are constantly activating, registering new apps, you're downloading them, you're implementing them into your systems, integrating them with the services that you already have, but not often enough do we actually do a thorough analysis of this application. We look exactly into the sort of features, configuration options that they are providing us. And more often than not, they might not necessarily be secure by default. They may simply provide us with a lot of different options, but they sort of they are expected to be installed in an already secure environment, right? So they are assuming that a secure network is already present, and therefore that's why the main options, security options, are not necessarily enabled. But that is exactly why, because of the multitude of applications that are available out there, we need to obviously make sure that enough research is done into them so that they're not necessarily posing any additional risk to our supply chain.
Yeah, I quickly want to jump on a point, maybe Neil and Emilian, that you guys touched upon, because we said, look, we need to know what's running in our environments. We need to know what's there. And of course, this goes back to, how should I say, more standard security practices of asset management and knowing what's in your corporate environment, etc. But I do want to highlight two things here, and that is specifically when it comes to the supply chain. It's really hard for organizations to have insight and visibility, not only into every single component that ends up, running as part of their technology stack, but also insight into the security practices of their suppliers. And the second step to that is, apart from insight and understanding, I think there's a question there of, to what extent is it, do organizations even really consider it as one of their responsibilities to go look into that? Now, of course, the more we hear these stories of like ransomware campaigns through the supply chain, etc., the more organizations will step up and feel that, okay, we need to expand here our area of concern. But then the next step on that is how do you gain control of it, especially in a situation where you're not attacked directly? Like, if you forgive me to jump back to my little co-op story, how could they have seen this coming, right? It's not software they use, it's a software that one of their suppliers is using, and it kind of trickled through automatic updates. And if we take a step back there, and I'm sorry because I'm opening up a whole lot of different cans of worms here, but it's fundamentally a reasonable security recommendation to say, patch your systems, apply the updates that come from your suppliers. So also I think from the perspective of us as security consultants, does this mean we need to review our advice? Do we need to enforce having staging systems for each and every update function? I believe that these supply chain attacks, and especially as they have shown themselves in the recent months, it does put a number of things into question and forces pretty much everyone, both companies that create the technology, companies that buy the technology and integrate it into their environment, but also us as security consultants to review some of these best practices and maybe expand on them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how can we, what do you guys think about, does this open new challenges or not?
I think if I can just add on what you said there, Thierry, just a small bit. If we look a couple of weeks back to the different kinds of vulnerabilities that had to do with Windows printing service, I think that is a pretty decent example of what you said right there, Thierry. Obviously, Microsoft had tried to patch that, but obviously the patch did not resolve the issue. Instead, it opened to a couple more avenues of attack there. So, exactly what you said there. Telling our customers and clients that patch your software immediately may not always be the best solution because of situations just like that one.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting challenge for the industry at large, because it's not a very one-sided, follow this process and you'll be protected from supply chain attacks. Kaseya is an example where the attack happened, everybody was waiting for the patch and sort of had to, rely on that to shore up the vulnerability. But then a lot of these other attacks we've seen in the past, CodeCov, SolarWinds, it's a patch that's issued that contains malware. And if you apply the patch, it makes you more vulnerable. So, it's two different challenges that kind of contradict each other, right? Which I think kind of goes back to why I think threat intelligence is important, because understanding these attacks and understanding, do we patch this or not, is always going to be important. But with the speed at which this stuff happens, appliances update automatically in a lot of cases. Ransomware attacks can take hours or sometimes even minutes for attackers to execute. It's a pretty big mountain we have to climb as far as, how do we, when these things happen, how do we respond as an industry, and how do we solve these problems in every individual case?
Yeah, and I think it's a big part of what we're seeing now is this move to everybody becoming a bit more aware of what the impact of technology. Thierry, if I can go to your co-op story as well. I think a local co-op would never have thought something that I use is going to actually cause me to almost shut down some technology that I use, because a lot of the times the general consumer market is ignorant to the powers that technology has. They just see the little blinky thing that helps them make their day easier or helps them make money, and then they immediately apply it and get it. And your general store owner is not going to know what the impact of this will be. But luckily or unluckily, what incidents like these bring to light is that people become more aware. We're getting that general education within the community that technology can be bad as well, and that you should understand what your risk profile is, and understand what this piece of technology is, and understand what, if that piece of technology is removed from your life or everything that it contains, what's the impact going to be on me and my business. And I think that's a very important thing. And I think that comes back to everything about understanding what your internal systems look like, understand not necessarily only your software, but your hardware internal systems as well. So making sure you understand and you've got good security architecture documents drawn up, and you've gone and you've actually threat modeled what those risks are that's going to be applied to you. And then you can go forth. But that still doesn't eliminate the problem from your trusted vendor now telling you, listen, there's been a security breach, update as quick as possible. And then you applying the update, and then that gets you owned in a sense. So I think like you said, Jordan, threat intel is very important, but I also think people need to understand what happens and what are the risks of the general actions that they do in their day-to-day within the IT industry as well. And Thierry, just coming back to some of the points that you had, I don't know what we're going to do to this space, because we're sitting with this problem, and we are sitting with a fact where we need to trust the people, but trusting the people also leads to problems. So I think we need to understand what those trust boundaries are very, very quickly. That's something that we've started seeing in the cloud environment. I think Emilian can attest to that, is something called the shared responsibility model, where the cloud providers are very direct about what is their responsibility, what is your responsibility. And I think that's definitely something that we can actually take out of what cloud has taught us and actually apply it to our general IT lives. If we can get explicit education on the fact of, this is your responsibility, this is my responsibility, I think that will bring that education a lot faster to the general community that makes use of tech products. If they understand that this is my responsibility, and if something goes wrong with this is what's going to happen to my company, or I'm going to lose this device, or I'm going to close my doors, then that is something that they definitely need to know when purchasing that item. So now we're sitting with, we've seen from the different cloud providers as well, that we've seen varying degrees of how well this is articulated about what's a responsibility where. And I can also see that in the future, we're probably going to head to a space where we're going to need to standardize this responsibility model. So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are of that, because we understand as a security community that certifications and making sure that you do compliance checks is important, but it doesn't necessarily provide direct security assurance in all cases. But it does provide some sort of security baseline that we can build off of. So yeah, I think that's a very important part that I think we can start adding into our space to start solving these problems.
I think, Neil, what you were saying there. Oh, sorry, Thierry.
Go ahead, Emilian.
No, I was just wanted to add on what you were saying there, Neil, is this shared responsibility model. I think it can be a very bit of a slippery slope in the cloud space, especially because yes, you do have this shared responsibility model, and it's very easy sometimes, especially if you don't do your due diligence and your research into the product that you're about to implement and use in your estate. It's really easy to fall into that trap of thinking, well, you know, I'm entrusting this responsibility to the cloud provider that I've selected. That means that, you know, I don't have to do anything else. For certain services, it might be the case, but the vast majority of the time, there is a certain degree of configuration that you need to still apply. Yes, the cloud provider does offer you that service. They will take care of running it, hosting it, and making it available to you and your customers. But that does not mean that you don't have any other homework to do after you add that. So I think it's an important point that we should help raise more awareness of, making it well understood for our clients, that it is a shared responsibility model. So they also have to do their part.
Yeah, I want to add to that, because fundamentally, I think there are some very good ideas in a shared responsibility model, and especially about clarifying and making more explicit, you know, whose responsibility or who's responsible for what. And I think sometimes that visibility and that being explicit about these things is missing a little bit. But I don't really want to jump. I think it's a bit too early to jump into a situation where we say, okay, this will be the solution to everything, because currently, in terms of cloud providers, there's only very few major players, and they kind of have the advantage of setting the rules, which might not apply in every single industry. So it might not be a blanket recommendation to move towards that. But I also want to take a step back and have maybe a more systematic look at the problem, because from my perspective, what we know right now is that the area of concern of organizations expands. It's no longer about their IT infrastructure and their software. It's also about the services that they purchase, the products that they purchase, the custom developments that are being done at their request, etc. Now, if you say, okay, how do you get control of that? Then, of course, first step will be to gain visibility, because even at this stage, I don't believe there's a mutual understanding of what it means to have a secure product. You know, I'm always a little bit naughty and tell the story that every single organization goes to their supplier and asks, do you have good security standards for the product you're trying to sell us? And the supplier will say, yes, they have. But what that really means in practice, where that standard is, where that level is, that differs between organizations at this stage. I think we also need to keep in mind that even though right now the area of concern is expanding, it doesn't mean that every organization is budgeting for that additional responsibility. You know, they have the manpower to verify these things. I also think we will need the involvement of non-technical roles in the organization. Many of these questions will probably be asked during a procurement phase. So it might be a totally different procurement department that gets involved. And I know there are some initiatives that are being taken to introduce security within procurement. I believe there's even some suggested standards for that as to what are the questions that can be asked to assess the security during a purchase. But again, I think as an organization, it's easy to answer a question. To what extent do you want to validate that or verify that yourself? To what extent is that fundamentally your problem? And I realize here I'm asking a lot of questions that I don't necessarily have very good answers to myself today. But for me, these are things that we need to consider from the perspective of our clients. Imagine we were a CISO today. And we were aware of SolarWinds, we were aware of Kaseya, we were aware of NotPetya, years ago, which was also a supply chain attack. What do we do? How do we gain control of this? How do we gain control of this space? And I think that currently we're not necessarily, like as an industry or as security practitioners as a whole, we're not necessarily at the stage yet where we have the visibility and we have the control to really get on top of this.
Yeah, one of the metaphors I like to use, and this goes beyond even supply chain security, but I always like to kind of describe security as a chain, right? Very apropos, I know, but when you look at it, it's it's only going to be as strong as the weakest link in the chain, right? If something is rusting or has a hole in it, then it doesn't matter how strong the rest of it is. So if we look at the links as maybe like patching policy, EDR, etc., it's very easy to draw the boundaries of that metaphorical chain at the boundaries of your network, right? Or the boundaries of what you have control over, of what you develop. But in reality, we can't do that. We have to, at least understand the risk posed to the third-party vendors that we use and posed to, all of these organizations and accounts and things that have some way or access into our network. And I understand what I'm saying here is a very scary sentiment, right? How is it ever going to be possible for us to understand all of these things? I'm sure even if you just go in and spin up a very simple, let's say Kubernetes environment in the cloud, and you toss a couple of open source software packages on there, suddenly you're using 5,000 different libraries that you've never even heard of before. How do you possibly manage that risk and understand all of those links in the chain? And I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, that supply chain security is going to be a community effort. It's not even just people internally, these other functions and everything. Those people absolutely need to get involved, but this needs to be something that doesn't just happen in an isolated space at each individual company or organization. It needs to be something that everybody contributes to and tries to solve. And I think not to open another one of Thierry's cans of worms, but I think that's part of why this is a problem that we've seen for years and years. Supply chain is hot on everybody's tongues right now, but this is a problem that's been in the industry, even before the turn of the century, right? You go back and you look at, Stuxnet or something like that. That was fundamentally a supply chain attack. And that's part of why it was so impactful and difficult for them to mitigate, is because it affected a lot of things where the companies that were being attacked by it didn't have direct control over them. So this is a problem that we've faced for years and years. And quite honestly, not to just spew doom and gloom, I think we are in a better place and on a better track than we ever were now, because we're talking about this and we're trying to solve it. That's a lot better than where we were 5 years ago, but there's still plenty of ground for us to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. I'm thinking about now, we've identified quite a lot of areas of how we're introducing risk into our organisations through third parties. I wondered if we could start to look at maybe some of the mitigations that would help to reduce that risk. And I might come to you first, Emilian, if that's okay, because we've talked a little bit about cloud and about the sort of insecure by default nature of some of the applications that we're adding into those environments. Can you think of advice, I guess, for people who do have, perhaps shadow IT, misconfigured cloud environments? Where would you start in terms of trying to tackle that from a third-party risk perspective?
So I would say That's a very, very good point, because obviously shadow IT is one of the main problems when it comes to these sort of situations, right? You do end up having, all of a sudden you think you start with the small environment, like Jordan, you were saying, you spin up a couple of resources in your cloud and a couple of services, and then you end up all of a sudden with a whole lot of applications that you're using that you don't even know where they're coming from, and users going around. And keeping track of that is very, very hard. But I would say IAM, Identity and Access Management, is one of the key features, because as you were talking about, Jordan, I liked your analogy, and it was one that I was about to use myself. Security in the end is very much a chain, and you are as strong as your weakest link. As weak as your weakest link. And so you need to, the aim should be trying to minimize those risks, trying to minimize those headaches. Obviously, it's not a switch solution. You just you activate a magical service and it does it all for you. There's a number of things that you can do. So, for example, tackling the problem of passwords and users. Very often, users are given the possibilities of setting up their own passwords, and that may lead to some risk, because inevitably they will end up choosing something that is relatively more easy. So having solid password policies, having multi-factor authentication, and ensuring that these are being applied consistently throughout the entire supply chain, your DevOps pipelines, your code repos, anything like that. Wherever you may have users that could have very advanced access to critical files and components, that is exactly where you should focus your resources more, because those users are the core users, the ones that could be most at risk of being targeted by spear phishing attacks or the like. And then the other side of IAM and shadow IT is the applications themselves, right? You need to, again, going back to the concept of having visibility upon your environment, upon your estate, and the components that you have, keeping track of that, trying to do periodic reviews of the applications that you are using, and the ones that you don't really use that much or have not even been used, you don't even know necessarily what they're there for. Same goes for the users, users that do not need necessarily to have very elevated access to some components, or users that perhaps are not even used anymore. For example, if we are talking about the development environment, users that come and go, testing users that do not need to exist anymore, all that kind of stuff, having a proper visibility upon that is very hard, but is something that you should definitely spend some time on and allocate some resources, because eliminating some of those users and applications that are not necessary can go a very, very long way in reducing that risk to which you're exposed, and effectively your overall cloud exposure.
Yeah, thanks, Emilian. Some good advice there. It makes me think about the people element, I guess, and the process element to some of this mitigation. I know, Neil, you're quite a passionate speaker about people, process, and technology, and the balance of all that, and not just sort of plugging in perhaps an IAM solution and hoping for the best, but actually that the trick is in perhaps the continuous use of that and the management of that process. Do you have any thoughts, I guess, more widely for us around supply chain risk and how you can tackle that from a process perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm a very big advocate for shifting to the left. I know that's a very big buzzword and a lot of people cringe at it, but it does ring true that a lot of organizations, as soon as they start shifting their security to the left, things just start working out for them. And when I mean shifting to the left, I mean not necessarily waiting for that inevitable pen test right at the end of your product lifecycle, your software development lifecycle, but adding in mitigations in the pipeline itself. So start looking at any tools or technologies that can help you, anything that can help you scan, say, these open source libraries that you use, or that can check these dependencies for publicly known vulnerabilities. I think that's a step in the right direction. And then shifting it even more to the left to making sure that you start adding security as part of that design process, making sure that your dev teams, everybody, junior devs, senior devs, the business analysts, the architects, engineers, everybody is aware of what security and the impact of security is. I think one of my biggest gripes is coming out of my own education is seeing how security has failed me specifically if I decided to become a developer one day. Luckily, I got my foot in the door as a security consultant and I got aware of all these troubles. But your average developer that is out there going through a software company doesn't necessarily know. They're not aware of all the security risks that get applied when they join the table, when they start producing code that may be insecure. So definitely education is a very big part of that, making sure that your developers are aware of what can go wrong, making sure that you've got at least one security champion, so somebody that's gone through some form of security training within those teams so that they can start advising on these design documentations, these product architectures, and that they can officially start threat modeling as a team. Because if you start making security as part of your daily stand-ups, your products is going to just start becoming secure by themselves. These developers are going to start including, you're going to see the results from your penetration tests. It's not going to be these long, big reports with a lot of vulnerabilities. You're going to start seeing reports where people couldn't necessarily find anything just because your developers are aware of what can go wrong. And I think that's a very big part of securing that entire process, is making sure that you don't necessarily only wait for the end, is that you go through every single step and do as much as you can. I think we hinted at it previously, but we also tout in the security community that there's never a silver bullet to fix something. And as we've seen from everybody that's spoken today, that this is a very, very big problem that a lot of people would need to tackle to actually solve and fully solve. And it isn't something that we can just go ahead and think, okay, cool, well, I've installed some sort of analysis tool in my pipeline. I can wipe my hands clean and I'm secure. I tick that box, check the regulation, and I don't have to worry about anything anymore. And I think that's a general ignorance that's in the space. And I don't know if there's a lot of times where there's either budgetary concerns or whatnot, or deadline pressures, or everything that's been put on people to produce not inferior products, but inferior in the terms of security, where there could have been done a lot more things to secure this product in the end. So I understand that there's two sides to the sword, that you want to do something, but to do something costs money. But let's just try and do as much as we can. Like my other colleagues have described it as a chain, I also see it as building up walls around your product. And if your wall is higher than your neighbor's wall, guess where that hacker is going to go knock, and not your wall. So yeah, I think that those are some points that's very close to my heart.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I guess there's a message in there, isn't there, about continuous resilience and continuous processes, and it's something that we're starting to hear more and more. How do you maintain resilience and understanding that, perhaps you are going to be susceptible to these things, because we've just discovered, it's really, really hard to keep a lid on. There are things that you may not even be aware of that suddenly come and cause you a problem. So how do you actually still maintain your business under fire, as it were? I wondered if I could come to you, Jordan, actually thinking about that point, but also keeping on the theme of people and perhaps behaviour analytics. And, as somebody who has to go in and try and work out what's going on, what kind of advice would you have, I guess, from a defensive perspective as to understanding what is malicious and what isn't, which is sometimes, I guess, quite tricky with a supply chain attack?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a huge problem, and I think, as has already been said several times, there's not necessarily a silver bullet, right? But I think the biggest recommendations I can give, and and these go hand in hand with everything that's already been said, but is really to just increase visibility and increase awareness when it comes to supply chain attacks. So on the visibility piece, every organization is going to be at a different spot in their level of maturity, in their ability to implement these things. But for those on the more mature side, something like an EDR agent or any other tooling that gives you like a full-scale view of what's happening in your network will go a long way towards mitigating these types of things. In fact, that first incident that I mentioned at the top of the call, in that case, the only reason they were able to bring us in so quickly is because they had EDR on the network and they saw something strange. They saw that there was an attack happening and they were able to engage us and, get that sorted ASAP, so to speak. But I also see plenty of incidents, supply chain or otherwise, where the attacker is on the network not for a span of months, but for a span of years. I've seen incidents that go back all the way into the early 2000s as far as exploitation, which is, just crazy. But, without that visibility, a lot of people have estates that are just, so vast and so complex that it's really impossible to do it manually or expect your users to see everything. So you really need that extra component. And, for organizations that are less mature, EDR might be, a little bit too lofty a goal, but even just a simple SIM, there's plenty of open source ones out there. Splunk is a very popular choice. I'm sure, most people listening to this are very familiar with, but implementing something like that, ingesting logs and analytics from all of these individual endpoints, so that when you get, let's say, IOCs for Kaseya, you can go plug those into your environment and maybe not know beyond the shadow of a doubt, but have a much better idea and sort of take off the blindfold when it comes to looking at these things. And then as far as the awareness piece, I know there's a lot of pieces here, but that's kind of the point with supply chain. Awareness-wise, I think I've already spoken to why threat intelligence is so important. And it's something that, not only do I think more organizations need to contribute to, but also more organizations need to take advantage of. There's threat intelligence communities out there and sources that you can ingest directly into a SIM or EDR, or even if you just go out there and read some of the most recent IOCs and things. I know a lot of government organizations like the FBI curate really great ones that you can sign up for. There's plenty of open source communities out there, but having that visibility into what's happening in the industry can also lead you to preempt these sort of things and sort of get behind the 8-ball before disaster strikes, so to speak. There's 100 more things I could say, but I think those are some of the key ones.
Thank you, Jordan. I wondered whether we might actually now move just to a couple of questions. And one of the questions is, what do most organizations get wrong? So I'm guessing this is from what we've seen. Where do people go wrong with supply chain? I don't want to pick that up. Maybe Jordan, actually, you might be quite well placed to pick that up from working in IR.
Yeah, so I mean, it's almost like the inverse of a lot of what we've said, right? So organizations with low amount of visibility will also often fall into pitfalls here. Organizations that don't have granular access control or control over accounts and permissions that are assigned, and honestly, organizations that just aren't thinking about these sorts of things. It's very easy when you're talking to a vendor and you're saying, hey, I want to implement your SolarWinds software. What do I need to do to install that on the network? And SolarWinds says, give us a domain admin account and we'll do the rest. It's so easy to say, okay, cool, thumbs up, let's get it implemented. But I think what's missing there is thinking, okay, hold on, do they really need a domain admin account? Do I need to give them this, super far-reaching access of my environment that if they're compromised, well, suddenly it's my problem, right? Whereas, maybe instead working with SolarWinds or working with this vendor to work out a more granular access model, you could put this in a DMZ, whatever the option is with the individual software. It's extra work, but that maybe extra couple of hours of investment up front might protect you down the line from an incident that not just costs you business hours, but costs you a lot of sleepless nights as well.
Yeah, I think something that just stood out there from what we said previously as well is just understanding the responsibility. And I think that's a very good example. So understanding that the security of your domain is not the, nothing bad to say SolarWinds, but let's just say the vendor that's selling you product A that now requires basically domain admin, understanding that it's not their responsibility to keep your domain safe. It's your responsibility to keep your domain safe. So handing over that keys to your kingdom is going to put you in not as necessarily a very good position. Sorry, I just wanted to add that onto that because that's just something that I practically saw that stood out from what we said earlier.
Yeah, thank you both. Amelia, you came off mute, so I don't know whether you also had a view.
Yeah, no, I was just about to add, obviously, to what Jordan said in terms of the cloud estates, at least from what I could see. Obviously, back to the question that we were trying to answer, things that can go wrong, things that we've most noticed going wrong. I would definitely say I am, again, just as Jordan mentioned, probably way too often we do see over provisioning of high privileged roles to either user accounts or service accounts. And that is definitely a problem. Obviously, we know that perhaps at the stages of testing or pre-production for certain types of activities, those high privileged roles are needed. But that is exactly when mitigating solutions such as just-in-time access could be useful. Or if I am to quote a service of Microsoft Azure, which is the cloud provider which I specialize, there's something called privileged identity management, which deals exactly with that, trying to give users and service principals a time-bound role assignment so that they can use that, do those sorts of highly privileged administrative activities whenever they need to do it, for the amount of time that they need to do it, and then that's it. The role gets revoked and they don't need to maintain that highly privileged account. And then the second big problem that we see would be in relation to login. I think, again, it becomes related to what Jordan was mentioning, and that is obviously it is very important to have that visibility upon what's going on. If you don't have a solid enough log collection and alerting capabilities, you're not even going to be aware of what is actually happening in your estate. So as Neil was saying, you do need to. It is your responsibility. The security of your account is your responsibility, right? And so proper logging and alerting capabilities can go a very, very long way. And sending those logs into SIEM solutions can then take you to the next step where you can do some actual threat analysis and behavioral analysis upon the sort of activities that are happening, and potentially for perhaps larger companies who can maybe afford to do that, doing some actual proactive threat hunting can also very much help you figuring out exactly what sort of things you could need to prepare for, because you don't even know about them until you do that sort of internal activity and hunting activity.
Great, thank you. And there's another question around what to do. So this one is just simply, where do we start? So I guess, we could take that from different levels of maturity as the start point, but did anyone want to step in and have a go at that one first?
Yeah, I want to. I don't mind. I think one of the very first starts, and maybe to provide some context, but I tend to work with vendors on bringing secure products to the market, both hardware and software. And I also work with other clients who are making large purchases or investments into these products to verify certain security claims. And I'd say that we really need to not treat security as an afterthought. So we really need to get it in throughout really every stage of a purchase. I'd say step one is gaining visibility, not just on what we have running in our own environment, but also on the security practices of our key suppliers, especially for any kind of component that we have that is critical to our operations or to the functioning of our organization. I would also make the case for having these security requirements as part of your supplier selection or component selection to make sure that when you design a product or when you want to purchase a product, that security and security practices of suppliers are considered in there. And then maybe as a third step, also, let's validate security claims. I mean, we probably, as Neil says, you cannot hand off the responsibility for the security of your organization and your environment to someone else. And I believe that is part also for the components or the solutions that we source from multiple vendors, is that in some cases, even more so when these components are critical to what it is that you're doing as an organization, let's verify and let's validate certain security claims, and let's also allocate the budgets within the organizations to be able to do that.
Thanks, Thierry. Anyone else want to chip in on that one? As where do we start, I guess, for each of your subject areas? Perhaps where would you start from in order to sort of do something tomorrow that's going to make an impact?
I think, I've gone on this topic quite a bit, is understanding what your environment looks like. It doesn't necessarily just mean having network diagrams, and that is very important. Don't get me wrong, but you also need to understand what the products and everything that you're developing also looks like. Like I said, making sure that you have good documentation, good security architecture representation of what that thing that it is you're developing looks like. Making sure that that security architecture trickles through your entire company, making sure that you understand what threats of your employees face, what threats your developers face, what threats your network face, what threats your development network face. And I think that ties in nicely what Thierry said. Is just understanding what everything looks like is a very good starting point. And then understanding the effect that everything has is a very good next stepping point, because as soon as that's the log collection and everything that Emilian spoke of, and that's very important to someone like Jordan to understand what goes on. So making sure that everything is collecting enough logs to make sure that it gives and paints a good picture of what's going on in your environment. So understanding what it looks like and understanding what's going on. So I think a very big concept that we're faced with is that we're sitting with this ignorance. Not necessarily, it might be in different stages of maturity, like you said, Julia. But if you can start going through those lists and looking at ticking off, like, do I know what it looks like? Do I know what it touches? And do I know what's going on in it currently? And if you can't answer those questions and you can't have internal help to answer those questions, definitely get somebody external that has that expertise to come help you answer those questions. But yeah, I think that's from my side, and it encompasses quite I think everything in your organization.
Great, thank you. I can see Jordan's face there, but I think we have actually lost him. I know he's in the middle of an incident at the moment, so there may be a reason why he's had to suddenly drop out. But we, I guess, as we're coming to a close in this session and starting to think about some of the key bits of advice. I mean, we've been through some really great stories and experiences that you've had. I mean, at the very top of the call, we were talking about, should we change the way we automatically patch? Should we think about staging environments? I think that's quite an interesting idea. And thinking about, the people and the process that surrounds what we're trying to achieve, visibility, getting some of those basics right, thinking about trust and your identity and access management and configuration, particularly in cloud. I wondered, just to, I guess, close out the session, if I could come to you with some closing remarks, I suppose, or closing thoughts on the topic of supply chain risk. Anyone want to volunteer as the first closer? Don't all shout at once.
Everybody's way too used to me volunteering, I guess. So my parting thoughts, maybe, is that taking a step back, I think that the recent incidents is like a bit of a new rise in supply chain attacks that we've seen. And I believe on the one side, it does increase the visibility of this type of attacks and also the associated risks with that. And I also think that it further expands the area or the concerns for organizations even beyond maybe the level where they were currently operating at, without necessarily having the means or the budgets or the manpower to tackle this in an effective manner. And I also want to reflect on the fact that supply chain risk as such is quite hard to get visibility of and even harder to get control of. But I think we touched on a number of steps that could be taken to at least, take the first steps toward gaining control of that. But I also want to mention that security has always been a process. It is still a process and it will remain a process. So different organizations, different suppliers, they operate at different maturity levels when it comes to security. I think we should also, with this new focus on supply chain risk, focus on the critical elements first. And maybe to end on a somewhat positive note, I think it's also a little bit like indicative of the progress that has been made towards security objectives of organizations in the past years, that now we're no longer only focusing on what happens in our own environments, but we can, we're maybe forced to, but still we can expand our views also to all the different suppliers that we work with and that make our companies a success.
Yeah, and I would say that, to add upon what Thierry was talking about, security, securing the supply chain is a process and is a hard process, because security as a whole is a very, very hard topic to get it right. And so I would say that a very important thing is, as mentioned previously, proactivity and mitigation, effectively trying to reduce as much as possible, doing as much as we can wherever we can, is key here. Reducing that risk as much as we can, reducing the weak links as much as we can, and ensuring that we have the proper visibility upon the resources in our tenant can help us greatly in figuring out exactly where should we then direct our focus when it comes to hardening these components.
And definitely from my side is something that I've been advocating for a very long time, as well as education. Get everybody in your organization as educated as possible in security. Security is my job, and it's hard for me to stay on top of everything that's going on. So just think about how hard it would be for your developers, your sysadmins, anybody inside your organization to stay on top of security. So making sure that they attend regular security courses, because we know the environments also change and everything changes and the threats change. So a security course that a dev did 5 to 10 years ago might not necessarily be as relevant anymore as what you would think or would hope it would be. It may increase their knowledge to a certain extent, but it doesn't increase their knowledge to what they need to look out for in the current age. So I would say educate your people. It is very important. I think that's going to eliminate a lot of problems, not necessarily only related to supply chain as well. I think that's a very, very big step that can be taken.
Thank you. That some really interesting thoughts there to close out, and particularly like just mentioning education there. Actually, it's something we hadn't touched on, but of course, yeah, the people element in this, and if we are to look at supply chain as a collective effort, thinking about all the people that are involved, and as you mentioned, Thierry, the procurement teams, even what kind of understanding is there, and how can we help everybody to sort of come together to tackle the problem. So, I mean, I think unless you've come off mute to say something else, Thierry.
No.
Okay. In which case, we've hit bang on 5 o'clock in the UK. So thank you very much to everyone who has joined us for this session. I hope that you found it useful and of interest. Particular thanks to those who joined me from F-Secure, Amelia and Thierry and Neil, and also Jordan, who unfortunately had to not leave his day job, but leave us instead to tackle something more important. And yeah, hope you'll join us again for another of these events. We're always really keen to hear from you. So if you have your own particular thoughts, if you disagree with us on anything in particular, that would be great to hear too. So hope you've enjoyed it, and have a lovely evening or rest of the day, wherever you're based. Thanks.